Hello, and welcome to the Labor Zone Podcast, an oasis of joy and learning, where one may escape from the rigors and the woes of the world. My name is Sam James, and I'm joined by Gabe Solidarity Christie. Gabe, how you doing?
I'm doing quite well. And tonight we're actually joined by two other special guests. So if you'd like to introduce yourselves, I'll start with Alison.
Hi, my name is Alison Glick. I am a writer and activist living in Philadelphia.
And Suzanne?
Hi, I am Suzanne Adely, and I'm a lawyer and labor organizer, and I live in New York.
Well, welcome. So we wanted to bring you on so that we can talk about the history of both anti-Zionism within the labor movement and also how labor institutions have contributed to Zionism. So, an easy topic to cover in like 45 minutes. But we at least wanted to get a broad history to kind of share that with the world. So I guess to get us started, I think it would probably be beneficial to just get some definitions out there. So if we can get a kind of broad definition of Zionism as a political movement. And either Suzanne or Alison, feel free to jump in.
Please go ahead, Alison. Yeah.
I would define Zionism as a political movement that essentially centers the establishment of a Jewish state on historical Palestine that necessitated the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. And that political movement was born in the late 19th century as, I would say, essentially a European nationalist movement, as others have identified it, but that was one that was centered in the historic land of Palestine. And that I think the critical thing to understand is that it necessitated the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants. And that's what we're seeing in the news headlines today as well.
Yeah. And would you, do you have anything to add for that or to that, Suzanne, or?
No, I think that's a pretty accurate description. I think that, like, for a time, there was some consideration of other territories in which they could sort of build this Zionist state, right? Including, I think, Uganda at some point, and also another place in the global south, I forget. But then they saw the connection advantage of kind of like making that connection to historical Palestine. It was kind of the driving ideology of the colonization project, which continues to this day. And it was very European, and it was very much a colonialist movement.
Yeah, and I would just add the linchpin, I think, was when the final decision was made, essentially, to align itself with the British colonial project in Palestine. That is where, the consideration of other entities, of other lands, was dropped by the Zionist movement when they saw that their aims would be best achieved by aligning themselves with British colonialism.
Mm-hmm. And so on that note, how did it develop kind kind of prior to the Balfour Declaration, and I guess we should also explain what the Balfour Declaration was and how that changed the situation. And again, either Suzanne or Alison, feel free to jump in.
Well, the Balfour Declaration of 1917 basically declared that there should be a Jewish national home in historic Palestine. And that was the opening salvo, if you will, of this wedding of Zionism to the British colonial project. And before that, I mean, there were various forms of Zionism, I guess you could say, cultural Zionism, dating back some years before that, that identified this cultural home of Jews in mandatory Palestine, but did not center itself on a territorial project, if you will. But that is essentially what predates the Balfour Declaration and the essence of the Balfour Declaration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Today is the anniversary of the signing of the Balfour Declaration, actually.
Oh, that is right.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
I missed that, Suzanne.
How about that?
Did not plan that, but I
Well,
don't know if that's I don't know if that's a good thing. It's certainly not something to really celebrate, but so we're also here to talk about the kind of labor story that is tied to all of this. So with that in mind, can you, Suzanne, can you explain what the Histrodute is and kind of how it developed?
Well, Histadrut is the kind of became sort of like the national Israeli labor union, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not as familiar as to how it was developed. I think that you were asking earlier about like how the Zionist project began, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that we started to see like European colonization to Palestine, at the turn of the 20th century, before even the Balfour Declaration was signed, before the creation of like the state of Israel. That kind of, at first, kind of the native Palestinian populations' response was like, okay, here are kind of like, here are some new residents, like, and there, there might have been, even with those early kind of settlers, I think that there might have been, some examples of like, collaboration kind of between the European Jewish community and like the Palestinian community, which was Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, actually, right? But Palestinians, and I think that there is some kind of history even of some like labor cooperation, right? But like with the Balfour Declaration, with the founding of the state of Israel, and with the Nakba, right, and the ongoing kind of like ethnic cleansing, Zionists really need to really build their nationalist institutions in order to kind of present themselves as this new strong state, and Histadrut is sort of part of that kind of like Zionist national institution. And I don't know exactly like when it was created, but the Zionist project ended up sort of seeing Histadrut as one of the tools to sort of get support, particularly like in the West, for the Zionist project. It was kind of used in a way, it's kind of as its own kind of lobbying for Zionism by using Histadrut as a vehicle to build relationships in places like the United States. I wonder if Alison knows more about that history.
I think, you can think of the Histadrut's role in a couple different ways, or on different levels. Before the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, it was essentially used to bring Jewish labor into the country, which of course was then utilized to expropriate land from the indigenous inhabitants. And then after the founding of the state, it was essentially used as a disciplining force to make sure that there was no cooperation of any meaningful kind between Palestinian laborers and Jewish laborers, who were particularly those not indigenous to the land, but really any Jewish laborers. Again, it was a tool of this ethno-nationalist project whose main goal was the establishment of a Jewish state on the land of Palestine, whose main goal, and perhaps I should have said this earlier, was to maximize the amount of land under the control of the Jewish state and minimize the number of non-Jewish inhabitants of the land. Again, a project that continues to this day. And so it's really used as a tool of settler colonialism up until the founding of the state, and then one that is utilized to entrench the colonial goals and to create a state that is more and more along the lines of an apartheid state, which of course we all know that's what exists today.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually, and one thing that had struck me in reading, I think, Michael Letwin's writing on it was the role or the amount that the Histadrut had to actually prevent solidarity from growing on the ground. That they had to actively suppress, like, there was one mention of Jewish housewives just wanting to go and shop at Arab stores, and that it was Histadrut members that had to go and physically prevent that from happening, to prevent any kind of cross-cultural collaboration happening.
Yeah, that's right. And the Histadrut itself would, I think, even attack its own members, if not, physically, in other ways, to prevent them from hiring Arab labor, at one point in its history, at least. Mm-hmm. So those relationships were seen clearly as a threat to the project. And I think the extent to which there was this, type of disciplining, or whatever you want to call it, had to do with, at least in the initial founding of the state, and at different times, when there were periods when it was when a different history was possible. And I think that a different history being possible was quickly dispensed with the stronger the state became, and certainly after 1967, when Jews in this country aligned themselves wholeheartedly with the State of Israel. And the State of Israel really became synonymous with Judaism, unfortunately, particularly in the mainstream Jewish community. It wasn't always like that, of course. Mm-hmm. There was, and perhaps we will get into this, there was anti-Zionism was normalized in the good sense of the word before 1967, and dating back, certainly into the 19th century. It wasn't an idea that seemed odd in the Jewish community, but that all changed, of course. Mm-hmm.
And I guess that leads us into kind of discussing the American side of it. Is most of my research into Jewish labor history has been fairly Bund and needle trades focused. And I've always, and I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Jewish Labor Committee and its founding in 1934 as specifically a anti-Nazi and anti-fascist labor group within the U.S., mainly pulling from the Jewish needle trade unions up in New York City, but that they stuck to the Bund, or the Jewish Labor Bund's line of not. It wasn't necessarily explicitly anti-Zionism for the Jewish Labor Committee because they weren't as involved in the politics of the period, aside from anti-fascism. But they had the idea that the Jewish question had to be solved in the country that Jews lived rather than through settling in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But that then very quickly changed to an almost complete about face in the post-war era. And that I'm still trying to suss out exactly how that happened. From my best guess right now, was probably a mixture of their pre-existing anti-communism, that both the Bund and all of the Bund-aligned unions in the United States were fairly strongly anti-communist, going back to disagreements in the beginning of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and that's a whole another long history that we do not have time for. But especially towards the end of the 40s, there were a lot of fairly left-leaning unions that were willing to participate in the Dees Commission and the House Un-American Activities Commission to attack their communist former comrades. And that ended up aligning a lot of these unions with kind of the U.S. state, which was then also aligning itself with the newly formed state of Israel.
That was a long question, Gabe.
Sorry, I don't know if that was a question. That's just been on my mind all day. But can you give any insight into kind of how that connection between the U.S. labor movement and Zionism developed moving forward in the 20th century in the post-war era? And I guess the post-48 era specifically.
Well, I think that, as Alison was saying, Zionism and its colonial project was not something that Jewish communities easily brought into, especially like in the beginning, right? And I think that went that was also the case for Jewish workers who were active like in the labor movement in the United States, and for other workers, non-Jewish workers, right? But that did start to change, and particularly like post-war, right? And I think that there's a lot of reasons for it, right? And I think number one is how institutions like Histadrut were actively lobbying, kind of through their relationships with the trade unions, right? And utilizing the trade unions in the United States to they themselves lobby the U.S. government for a change in policy. But I think that more than that, it just also reflected the kind of political changes that were just going on in the labor movement itself, right? Just kind of those decades of weeding out communism, the decades of like weeding out kind of like more kind of rank and file, kind of empowered, kind of like critical perspective about like what labor leadership is doing, like, and so as that changed, so did kind of the creation of more hierarchical unions who kind of like were then responding to this call to support Zionism, right? And I think also, I mean, this is not a labor union, but I'm part of an organization called the National Lawyers Guild, right, which is a kind of professional association. And we currently have a very strong position on Palestine, right? We've had a strong position. We were one of the first to use the words apartheid and call for BDS and to support the right of Palestinians to resist. But our organization supported the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 and even passed a resolution, at the time, I think, condemning the U.S. government for not sending military, not sending arms, right, to the Haganah, who were also kind of like actively, materially colonizing Palestinian lands. And we're actually trying to pass a resolution this year, like officially apologizing for that. And then when you kind of ask, especially kind of like the older generation, they'll say that like, oh, it was because they were supporting the Soviet line that's sort of excuse that they will give, right? And I can understand that, like, I could see certain organizations and institutions that are just really very sectarian and just falling into like following the perspective of whatever sort of like party that they're attached to. But there was a lot more going on. I think just the repression of the labor movement itself over the years, turning it into something very, very different. The Zionist lobbying, and then also like the ability for people to be able to really empathize with people of the global South, as opposed to sort of empathize with the European worker.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of led to a labor Zionism that exists to this day.
Yeah. I think Suzanne brings up a great example of the NLG. Because another thing that happened with the NLG is that, and I think this is an example of what was happening also in the Jewish community, is the Red Scare and McCarthy era really decimated the ranks of organizations like the NLG. Although I'm, not a labor historian by any stretch of the imagination, I think that also decimated the ranks of, workers writ large who were trying to organize at the time for obvious reasons. I also think at that time, but also preceding and afterwards, that is the time of the founding of the state, there within the Jewish community itself, there was the sort of hierarchical German Ashkenazi Jews who were watching with horror as these, the rabble of the kind of Russian Pale were immigrating into the United States. They were, largely quite poor, quite, they were laborers, and they had a different take on what it meant to be in this country than their largely German Ashkenazi brethren, so to speak, who had immigrated many years before. And I think that history became the history of what you see in the Jewish community today, in some respects, that they were the founders of the mainstream Jewish organizations that became the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the AIPAC. They were they were the genesis, so to speak, the ideological genesis of the organizations that we see today that fight so vehemently against those supporting Palestinian rights. And at the time, that included making sure that these radical, Jews from the Russian Pale weren't too radical here in the United States. And what could we do to, again, sort of discipline them, to assimilate them, and to bring them into their ideological sphere of what it meant to be an American. And I think that plays a part in this as well, in terms of the challenges that were faced throughout this history when anti-Zionism was essentially abandoned for a full-throated Zionism that we see today.
I think that analysis lines up really well with Philip Nicholson, author of Labor's Story in the United States, because he talks a lot about how there was a move towards not quite respectability politics in the labor movement post-war, but basically the elected labor leaders had gotten comfortable being in positions of power and had started to seek more proximity to the power that existed. And that's how, or at least in his analysis, he argued that that's how not only they allowed themselves to get wiped out in HUAC because they were feeling much more comfortable than they probably should have been, and should have been able to recognize that their positions were fairly precarious. But those that survived the McCarthyism were willing to cozy up to the imperialism that was growing, which then also would tie that whole movement into Zionism.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So now I want to pivot to kind of the return to anti-Zionism. And I guess before that, we should also recognize the fact that Palestinian history exists, because we haven't really talked about it yet. So if we can very briefly cover the, I guess, first 2 decades of the Palestinian life after the Nakba, moving up to the 6-Day War. Obviously, that again is a lot to cover.
You have 30 seconds.
Either Suzanne or Alison.
Suzanne, do you want to go first?
You can start. It's fine.
Well, Palestinian life after the Nakba. Just so your listeners know exactly what the Nakba is. The Nakba is an Arabic word meaning catastrophe, which is how Palestinians describe what happened to them in 1948, when, starting before the war that resulted in the creation of the state, they were ethnically cleansed from their homes, forced out of their homes at gunpoint in major cities in Palestine. And then once the war started in earnest, over 400 villages throughout historical Palestine were erased from the map, literally. There were massacres, bombing campaigns, that resulted in over 750,000 Palestinians fleeing from their homes. That's the Nakba. And as you can imagine, after that occurred, of course, those Palestinians were not allowed to return to their homes after the cessation of hostilities. And those who did attempt to return were treated as, quote unquote, infiltrators and either detained or shot on sight. So it was made very clear that there was no returning to their homes. And that's 750,000 Palestinians just in 1948. And those are the Palestinians who populate the refugee camps throughout the Arab world, as well as in Gaza. In addition to that, the Palestinians who did remain were under military rule until I believe it was 1956, and so they eventually became technically citizens of the state, but only after enduring, close to a decade of military rule, and being forced to live as second-class citizens. In 1967, during the war that resulted in the occupation then of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip by the Israeli military, even more Palestinians were pushed out of their homes and were made refugees. As you might imagine, this resulted in the decimation of Palestinian political, social, and cultural life throughout the state of Palestine. But I guess one thing that's is important to note is that throughout this period, really, despite the repression, despite the odds being stacked against them, there were attempts to organize. There was a military resistance against the occupation, both in 48 and 67. Of course, that was brutally put down. But there were also cultural life did continue in one form or another throughout this period, and has, I think, always been a part of Palestinian resistance itself. What we hear a lot about, of course, especially these days, is military resistance, which, of course, is codified in international law as a right of an occupied people. But I think it's also important to remember that organizing of various types, and I'm sure Suzanne can speak more eloquently than I to this, including among laborers, including among cultural workers, including among, teachers and students. So it's kind of a mixture of intense repression, brutal violence, but ongoing resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you ended it is a good summary, right? I mean, I think, it's the Nakba has continued until until today. I mean, it's current. It's just sort of like, between Nakba and 1967, but then further on, it's just further and further sort of expansionist policies by the state of Israel, which, is done through different acts of ethnic cleansing and colonization. And, so there are a lot other historical examples of massacres that happened as well during that time, like the massacre of workers at Kfar Qasim in 1956, right? Or sort of like, just sort of the daily aggressions that were taking place in kind of the militarized areas before they even occupied Palestine. I mean, the West Bank and Gaza, and then when they started to occupy West Bank and Gaza, that continued even further, and with the expansion of the settlements, which are also very militarized zones, we're just sort of seeing a history of like increased sort of colonial violence in different forms and different manifestations, right? And as Alison said, also consistent resistance. I mean, going back to even the 1930s with the peasant revolt, with the peasant worker sort of revolt. I mean, a lot of what Palestinian resistance has looked like has been strikes, right? It has been strikes and boycotts, as well as like armed struggle, which is sort of which is their right. And and I mean, I'm kind of like jumping in history right now, but like a lot of what, the sort of like strategy had been on Israel's part through the development of things like the Oslo Accords, right, was really to also kind of like undermine the ability for Palestinians to attempt to kind of undermine the ability of Palestinians to kind of remain a united sort of like force of resistance, right? By kind of physically separating them into Bantustan's, but and also by creating, like facilitating the PA's creation of its own police force to act as also kind of like further suppression of like grassroots Palestinian resistance and so on. So it's a lot.
Mhm. And on just on the PA's police force, there's one. Again, we're jumping around in history a lot, but there's one quote that I just loved when I think it was talking about the 2004 teachers strike. But there's an interview of a police officer from the Palestinian Authority who is complaining that citizens in every country complain about the police in their country, and just the fact that you're saying that and not quite asking the question of why.
Right.
But the and if I'm not mistaken, also it wasn't until 59 that Palestinian workers were allowed to join the Histadrut, and even then they were still kind of relegated into more menial, lower paying jobs, even within what was ostensibly a union fighting for them.
Yes, that's my understanding.
But now I want to swing back to the United States to talk about kind of the rise of anti-Zionism that developed here with the Arab auto workers in, I think it was 1973 in Detroit.
Right.
Can you talk on that at all, Suzanne?
Sure. So, that was a very sort of significant historical moment, I think, for the Palestine solidarity movement in the U.S., for the BDS movement, and for the labor movement overall. And so in 1973, there was a strike by Arab American auto workers who were demanding that the UAW divest from Israeli bonds, right? And I think that sort of, which I believe lasted about 2 days, and kind of did result in some kind of concessions from the UAW in terms of like divestment, but like they're still invested right now as well as like many other large unions, except there's not a lot of transparency around that too. So we don't always know sort of the extent, and also to break relations with Histadrut. And I think that like one important things to sort of say about this is that like this is Detroit in the early 70s, and this is kind of like in the backdrop of like the race uprisings, right, and also the formation of other really militant labor organizations like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, which I think that like the interaction with in the interaction that Arab American workers had with those movements, I think, including the solidarity that they received from those movements, right? If you can see examples of publications from organizations like Drum and Solidarity with Palestine at that time, but also kind of just kind of like the exposure to kind of that kind of militancy sort of really, I think, was sort of significant in perhaps kind of the Arab auto workers thinking that like this is a good time, this is something that we can achieve, right? You know, there's been, I think what's also interesting to point out, you know, when I was researching this moment in history, I found also a flyer from a 1974 UAW convention in which that was passed out by the Arab Workers Caucus, right? And it had like a platform that they were presenting, which was calling for, you know, basic health and safety conditions in the job, anti-discrimination, sort of like policies in the job, but it was calling also for, you know, anti-racist sort of solidarity, but also it was calling for workers to, and for the union to organize itself in solidarity with the movement for self-determination of peoples of the global South, right? So there was a kind of internationalism, right? That place in that moment, right? Or not just in the labor movement, but I think in our movements as a whole, right? That we don't necessarily see. It's not that there is internationalism in labor now, but I think it's a bit different, right? And it also just kind of like reminds me of you know, not too long before that, there was also a Yemeni farm worker who was the first farm worker that was killed in the movement to create the United Farm Workers Union, right? Or to win collective bargaining rights for farm workers in California. And if you see pictures of his funeral, like the community came out with like the flag of the UFW Union, the flag of Yemen, and pictures of Abdel Nasser, and I think also Palestinian flags. So there was also kind of like an Arab nationalism that it was internationalist in itself as well. Like, you know, but, you know, it's a very significant thing because I don't think that a lot of people know that like that auto worker strike was the very first BDS call. In the United States, people think that the BDS movement started like 10, 15 in the US 10, 15 years ago.
So on that note, can you talk a little bit about how BDS has developed since 73 and expanded both in the US and abroad, and actually what it is as well?
So the BDS movement is like the call from Palestinians for you know, the solidarity movement to organize, to boycott, organize to pressure institutions to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, right? And I think that you know, that really comes down to kind of, you know, not so much individuals, but divesting from institutions, businesses that are complicit, right, in the colonization project, you know. And also the call for sanction is to you know, to sanction sort of Israel, and like something like that would look like, for example, removing Israel from the United Nations, which was something that was called for against South Africa at some point too, like, you know, or for states like, you know, Chile, Colombia, Bolivia to recall their ambassadors, or like in the case of Bolivia, completely cut off diplomatic ties with Israel. That falls under, I think, like sanctioning, for example, right? So it's kind of like broadly defined, but the call is to really continue to demand that until Israel, you know, follows international law, adheres to international law, and stops, you know, the colonization, occupation of Palestine. And you know, I mean, since that time, you know, the BDS movement itself has really grown. And has really won some major victories around the world and in sort of like different sectors of society. That hasn't necessarily changed the facts on the ground for Palestinians, right? But it has succeeded, at least I think, in helping to sort of like isolate Israel and gain awareness as to the kind of oppression that is happening against the Palestinian people, and we do know that the public opinion is really in solidarity with Palestine, except really for the ruling elite and like I think the fascist forces that support them. Like, we can just see from the way people are reacting, right now. I mean, of course, and, there are a lot of liberals that are like reinforcing the ruling elite's policies. But in the labor movement, it hasn't really kind of like been that easy to get the labor movement to mobilize in the same way that the Arab workers in the early 70s did, for a lot of different reasons, because labor Zionism really was really successful, and also because we don't really have democratic unions where we find it very often not that hard after some organizing to get the sympathy and solidarity of rank and file. The rank and file don't necessarily have the ability to push their hierarchical unions to act in the way that they need to, right? But like when we look at sort of like the history of like the ILWU on the West Coast and how they, as a rank and file, decided not to handle kind of cargo that was going to apartheid South Africa. I think it was kind of like moments like that really kind of became sort of the roots it's really kind of like what we looked to, like, when Labor for Palestine, which I'm a part of, was formed, right, in 2003 or 4, right? It was really that ILWU rank and file movement against apartheid that we looked to sort of like be the catalyst, the history that we were trying to sort of like utilize to like start to sort of move like other sort of rank and file towards thinking about how their labor institutions could play a significant role in supporting Palestinian movement and in supporting the BDS movement, right? Of course, we knew about the Detroit workers movement, but we thought that they like really kind of making that connection with Black workers and the anti-apartheid struggle really would resonate more with kind of like the modern sort of like working class, and in many ways it does, right? And so I would just say this, that over the years, like every time that there's been an escalation of the war on Gaza, right, or like in the West Bank, or like that, like we saw more and more kind of like the rank and file communities from different sectors moving more and more towards understanding and supporting Palestinian solidarity, right? So now where we have hundreds of people on a call, right, ready to sort of stand in solidarity with, and the way that we need, what we really had to do to penetrate that is kind of navigate through that hierarchy, right? Because what we found is if there's a healthcare worker who's Palestinian, or a teacher who's Palestinian, or like a factory worker who's Palestinian, and wants to have a discussion with their coworkers about what's happening with them and their family and ask for solidarity, that there were gatekeepers, union officials, that were just preventing those conversations from happening in the first place, right? And then when they did, we saw examples too of like different UAW locals who back in 2014 kind of like did the organizing, did the work, and got like a large sort of critical mass of their rank and file to support a solidarity statement, right? That was kind of like thwarted by like UAW leadership that had you said that they that they could not allow for this sort of to continue to stand, that it was nullified because they had signed basically an MOU with the Jewish Labor Committee saying that they would not support BDS initiatives. I mean, it kind of was initiated by another UAW member who opposed it, and it was appealed and so on. But ultimately the decision was because UAW leadership at the time said that they had signed such an MOU, right? Which I think then points to the kind of ways that labor Zionism has continued to organize, right? Even if their ranks are smaller, they're still sort of very sort of targeted organizing to sort of undermine efforts at Palestine solidarity from some gatekeepers like Stuart Applebaum of RWDSU, which I say that, I actually work with RWDSU through my labor organization, but everyone knows Stuart Applebaum has been a driving force of Zionism and the labor movement,
It's interesting to me, the analogy that one could make with what Suzanne just described in terms of the gatekeepers in the union movement and the gatekeepers in the Jewish community writ large, because what they're gatekeeping against, of course, is young Jews under 40, who are overwhelmingly not behind the policies of the state of Israel, at the very least, and who are abandoning in droves the visions of Zionism, who don't identify with that vision, who don't identify with the policies, and who are being punished for expressing that. And it strikes me that that's a similar situation with what's going on in the labor movement. And it's something that is really swelling the ranks of anti-Zionists, because if a young person is told, well, no, you can't invite a Palestinian historian to speak to your Hillel, which is the on college campuses, the Jewish sort of student center, very well funded. If you invite a Palestinian historian to talk to your group, we're going to defund you. I mean, this is just citing one example, very heavy-handed tactics to make sure that any type of national solidarity cannot happen. And as young people have throughout history, they see right through it and they rebel against it and they begin asking more questions. So it does, in some respects, I think, have it backfires. But it's interesting, these sort of parallel phenomenon, both in the labor movement and just, in the Jewish community overall. Another point I would make regarding BDS in terms of the development of anti-Zionism and solidarity is the BDS movement, of course, didn't invent the tactic of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It adapted those tactics that were developed, of course, during the anti-apartheid struggle and the civil rights struggle in this country and many other places I think we could cite. But just to cite those as the most relevant ones for this discussion, I think. And it really problematized the Jewish community's almost obsessive identification of itself with the civil rights movement in this country. Because if you read various people who have written about that era, there's always a mention of, this or that rabbi who marched with Martin Luther King, or, of course, the fact that there are a lot of Jews who were involved in Freedom Summer, for example, one of whom was, of course, murdered. So how do you then cite that proud example of our history on the one hand, but on the other hand, call boycott the Palestinian BDS or boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement anti-Semitic. It's one of many, many, cognitive examples of cognitive dissonance that is really collapsing. And it's also because it's collapsing and because people aren't having it anymore, especially young people. It's why repression is heightening and will continue to heighten, I believe, into the future.
We may have lost you a little bit at the end there.
Yeah.
I heard her perfectly.
Okay. Well, I guess it was just me. And I also wanted to touch on the kind of gatekeepers discussion, because then there's also situations where, Starbucks Workers United released a statement in solidarity with Palestinians, which then led Starbucks, the corporation, to sue them. And I think they're currently battling it out. But there's just an interesting, or you can see where the interests of everyone the interests of everyone who is preventing this are aligning, and who those interests are aligning with. When you have literally the bosses that you're fighting against aligning in their interests with union leaders and community leaders within the Jewish community, there's clearly something probably not right there that needs to be further examined. And so with jumping off from Starbucks Workers United right now, and without breaching any operational security, where do you see this movement going in the future? Because obviously right now we're in a crisis moment, where there's an active genocide and ethnic cleansing happening in front of our faces. But and not necessarily the time to do slow on the ground person to person organizing. But I'm just interested in your kind of thoughts on that, Suzanne, where you see all of this going, where both practically and hopefully.
Yeah. One other sort of important labor action that took place was the block the boat action. Particularly, we did sort of have a national day of action where we had simultaneous block the boat actions in New York and in Oakland, where the strategy was to try to stop the Israeli Zim ship from being able to dock and be unloaded. And that succeeded in the Bay Area, not because the ILWU directly signed up to sort of refuse, but because the community created a picket line, and the ILWU was sort of empowered to say that we won't cross the picket line, right? And so Zim wasn't able to sort of unload New York, New Jersey, the port of Newark. We weren't really able to do that. And we don't really see any opportunity to do that anytime soon. It's very hard. It's a different union. It's a different town. But there are other logistics unions around the world, right, that are standing up, including in Belgium recently, right? Mm-hmm. And I think transport worker unions and other unions are refusing to allow kind of Israeli shipments to flow, right, or to sort of be sent out or be handled. I think we might expect more actions from other international unions, like from Italy and South Africa and so on. Those are all very, very significant, right? And I'm saying this is because we really need to sort of stand up to the challenge of saying that we have to stop arming Israel. And this is not a labor movement, but there's been a really important direct action that started in the UK and is happening in the US by Palestine Action, which is like that are sort of like blocking the entrances of Albayt systems just to like try to shut down the business of the arms trade, right? Now, as far as like other US unions, whether they be Starbucks or they be teachers unions or academic unions, I think that like, I mean, you're right. It's like, it's not time for the teach-ins. It's like it's time to be like, okay, what do you got? What are you going to do? And I think that one of the things that Labor for Palestine has been thinking about is calling for like a national day of action for labor, right? We might actually end up attaching that to another national day of action that's recently been called by some of the Palestinian groups, but so just sort of do a labor specific one. And the idea is like, because I run an alliance of like 33 worker organizations that have different levels of precarity, right? From worker centers to unions. And so whenever we have a kind of a day of action, we give people an opportunity along a spectrum of different ways to participate, right? From just like wearing a particular color or wearing a button to walking out, like, really kind of depending on the level of power that workers might have. Because we know that like there's a lot of situations where workers have little power in this country, and so that's one thing that we're hoping to do and just sort of see what happens. But I think we still need to continue to, educate and sort of like bombard like the leadership, especially the ones that are stepping up to saying, okay, like, this is the time to demand the divestment from the bonds. This is the time to demand that they cut off the relations with Histadrut. And on one level, and this is the kind of the contradiction today, on one level, it's like, it feels like we're moving people more than ever, right? But on another level, it also feels like that there's a lot of apologists for genocide, right? And I'm sure like and that includes the labor leadership. So I think there's got to be a confrontation. We're going to see there's got to be a confrontation between those two contradictions, like in our labor spaces, and we have to be ready to just sort of support that. I mean, Alison was talking about the backlash. As sort of a leader of the NLG, I'm the president, and like we're kind of one of the groups has kind of been trying to respond to all of this backlash, right, on campuses, in protests and in the workplace, right. We've never seen this much kind of harassment, intimidation, discrimination, and firings in workplaces in regards to Palestine before, like in everywhere from like low wage work to like hospitals to like schools and so on. So it's not easy, right? Yeah. So I think it's really just about people kind of rising to the challenge. And I know there was another labor call tonight with probably a few hundred people, mainly rank and file folks that are like strategizing as to like what they can do.
Roger that. And I think I've, at least from talking to and listening to some of the more radical rank and file focused thinkers, I've been feeling like that confrontation that you were talking about in terms of solidarity with Palestine, that I think there's broader confrontations that are starting to show up across the labor movement as well, to kind of break down the hierarchical unions that have come out of the New Deal era. And so it is certainly something that is interesting and both exciting and terrifying to watch.
Indeed.
True.
But I think at the risk of going on and talking about all of this for another hour or two or three, because there's still a lot to cover. I don't have any other pressing questions. Do you have anything, Sam?
Are you kidding me? No. Unfortunately, there just wasn't a lot for to make light of, especially with everything going on in the world. But I think
I made sure that I had control of the soundboard for this, so
no DJ air horns. But I think not nice. That's not the word. Interesting. It's interesting to know, as someone who is not well versed in any of this, as you three are, that this situation that we're going through right now did not start and end on October 7th. This has been going on, and it's a lot more convoluted than people think. So people really need to get out there and listen to what's going on and read the history. So I appreciate both of you coming on, Alison, Suzanne, and educating me and educating our listeners. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And stay safe and have as much fun as anyone can right now.
Onwards.
Thank you.
Well, have a great night.
Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.